The morning of June 15th, 1987, dawned clear and bright over Millbrook County, Nebraska, but by afternoon the sky had turned an ominous shade of green that every farmer in the region knew meant trouble. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the wind bend the cornstalks in ways that made her stomach clench with worry. Her husband, Tom, had been out since dawn, checking the irrigation systems in the far fields, and the storm was moving in faster than anyone had predicted. If you're enjoying this story of mystery and determination, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring you more compelling true stories like this one. The radio crackled with severe weather warnings as Sarah tried Tom's walkie-talkie for the third time in 10 minutes. Static filled the kitchen, punctuated only by the increasingly violent rattling of windows as the wind picked up speed. She glanced at the clock. 3:47 p.m. Tom should have been back by now. He always made it back before the worst of any storm hit, a habit born from 32 years of farming this land that his grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. Their daughter Emily, home from her sophomore year at the University of Nebraska, looked up from her textbooks spread across the dining room table. At 19, she had inherited her father's practical nature and her mother's intuitive worry. "Mom, maybe we should drive out to find him," she suggested, though they both knew that with the storm bearing down, venturing out in their old pickup would be more dangerous than helpful. The tornado sirens began wailing at 4:15 p.m., their mechanical screams mixing with the howl of wind that now sounded like a freight train approaching from the west. Sarah and Emily huddled in the basement, listening to their house groan and creak above them as hail the size of golf balls hammered the roof. But Sarah's mind wasn't on the storm damage. It was on Tom, somewhere out there in the fields, possibly taking shelter in one of the old barns or equipment sheds scattered across their 800-acre property. When the all-clear finally came 2 hours later, they emerged to find their world transformed. The tornado had cut a path directly through the eastern section of their property, leaving behind a landscape of twisted metal, splintered wood, and corn stalks driven into fence posts like spears. 3 of their outbuildings were completely gone, reduced to scattered debris that would take weeks to clean up. But there was no sign of Tom or his red Ford pickup anywhere. The search began immediately. Sheriff Robert Clayton, a man who had known the Mitchell family since he was a boy, organized teams of volunteers from neighboring farms and the volunteer fire department. They combed every inch of the property and the surrounding area, calling Tom's name until their voices were hoarse. Helicopters from the County Rescue Service flew grid patterns over the region, looking for any sign of the missing farmer or his vehicle. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The National Weather Service determined that the tornado had been an F3, with winds reaching 165 miles per hour, powerful enough to lift and carry heavy objects for miles. Some theorized that Tom and his truck had been picked up by the tornado and deposited somewhere far from home, perhaps in a remote area where they might never be found. Others suggested he might have tried to outrun the storm and crashed into a creek or ravine that hadn't been thoroughly searched. Sarah refused to give up hope, even as the official search was scaled back and eventually called off. She drove the country roads for hours each day, checking every ditch, every abandoned farmstead, every grove of trees where wreckage might have been deposited. Emily postponed her return to college, unable to abandon her mother in her desperate search for answers. The 2 women became a familiar sight to other farmers in the area, always looking, always hoping, always asking if anyone had seen anything that might provide a clue to Tom's fate. As 1987 turned to 1988 and then to 1989, the community's active involvement in the search gradually faded, though their support for Sarah and Emily never wavered. The missing person case remained open, but with no new leads or evidence, Sheriff Clayton could only offer sympathy and the promise that if anything turned up, he would investigate immediately. Tom Mitchell had simply vanished into the storm, leaving behind a wife, a daughter, and questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. The insurance company eventually paid out on Tom's life insurance policy, though Sarah had to fight for it, arguing that while his body had never been found, the circumstances of his disappearance during such a violent storm made his death a reasonable conclusion. She used the money to keep the farm running, hiring seasonal help when needed, but the heart had gone out of the operation for her. The land that had once represented security and tradition now felt like a constant reminder of loss and unanswered questions. Emily finished college and became a teacher, but she never moved far from home. She married a local man, David Chen, whose family had run the hardware store in town for 2 generations, and they built a small house on the edge of the Mitchell property. Even as she started her own family, Emily maintained the hope that someday they would find out what happened to her father. She kept his photograph on her mantelpiece and told her children stories about the grandfather they would never meet, the man who could coax life from the stubbornest soil and who never missed Sunday dinner with his family. Sarah aged in the way that grief ages a person, not just with the passage of time, but with the weight of carrying unanswered questions. Her hair went completely grey within 2 years of Tom's disappearance, and she developed a habit of standing at the kitchen window at sunset, looking out over the fields, as if she might see him walking home at any moment. She never remarried, never even dated, telling anyone who suggested it that Tom might still come home, and she intended to be there when he did. The farm struggled financially without Tom's expertise and full-time attention. Sarah did her best, learning aspects of the business that Tom had always handled, but by the mid-1990s it became clear that she would need to start selling off portions of the property to make ends meet. The first parcels to go were the ones furthest from the house, the eastern fields where the tornado had done the most damage and where the search for Tom had been most intensive. A development company bought 200 acres in 1996, planning to build a subdivision called Millbrook Estates. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as the bulldozers cleared the land where she and Tom had once planned to build a retirement home. Part of her was relieved to have the financial pressure lifted. Another part felt like she was betraying Tom's memory by selling the land he had loved so much. But Emily supported the decision, pointing out that her father would have wanted his family to be secure above all else. The subdivision was never built. The development company went bankrupt in 1998, leaving behind only cleared lots, paved roads that led nowhere, and a few concrete foundations that gradually became overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees. The land that had once been productive farmland became a ghost development, a reminder of both economic ambition and the enduring power of the rural landscape to reclaim what had been taken from it. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the mystery of Tom Mitchell's disappearance became part of local folklore. Older residents would sometimes share the story with newcomers, explaining the empty fields and the woman who still lived alone in the farmhouse at the end of the gravel road. True crime enthusiasts occasionally contacted Sheriff Clayton's office or reached out to Sarah directly, hoping to investigate the cold case, but nothing ever came of their inquiries. Sarah's health began to decline in her 70s, and Emily gently suggested that it might be time to consider moving to town, perhaps to one of the senior living communities near the hospital, but Sarah was adamant about staying on the farm. "This is where he'll look for me," she would say, and Emily learned not to argue. David helped maintain the property, keeping the house in good repair and ensuring that Sarah had everything she needed to live independently for as long as possible. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought an unexpected isolation that Sarah had, in many ways, been preparing for her entire adult life. She had spent 33 years living with the absence of her husband, and the enforced solitude of lockdown felt familiar rather than frightening. Emily and David checked on her daily, leaving groceries and supplies on the porch and talking through the screen door. But Sarah seemed almost content in her solitude, tending her small vegetable garden and reading the romance novels that had become her escape from reality. It was during the pandemic that Sarah began to seriously consider what would happen to the remaining property after she was gone. Emily and David had their own house and lives, and neither of them had shown much interest in farming. The logical thing would be to sell the remaining acreage and the farmhouse, letting someone else worry about maintaining the buildings and working the land. But the thought of strangers living in the house where she and Tom had raised Emily, where they had shared 32 years of marriage, felt like a final betrayal of everything they had built together. The decision was ultimately taken out of her hands. In March of 2023, Sarah suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to live alone. Emily and David moved her to a care facility in town, and the farmhouse stood empty for the first time since 1923. Emily visited the property regularly, checking for storm damage and vandalism, but she found the silence in the house almost unbearable. Every room held memories of her parents, of family dinners and Christmas mornings and quiet evenings when her father would read the farm reports while her mother worked on quilting projects. The estate planning process forced Emily to confront the reality that the farm would need to be sold. The care facility was expensive and Sarah's savings wouldn't last indefinitely. Emily hired a real estate agent who specialized in rural properties, and they began the process of evaluating the land and buildings to determine fair market value. It was during this evaluation, in the summer of 2024, that someone finally entered the old hay barn that had been sealed up since the tornado damage of 1987. The barn sat in what had once been the northeastern corner of the property, about half a mile from the main house. The tornado had damaged the roof severely, and rather than pay for expensive repairs to a building that wasn't essential to the farm's operation, Tom had boarded up the entrances and essentially abandoned it. Over the years, weather and neglect had warped the boards that sealed the doors, and small animals had found ways in and out, but no human had set foot inside the structure for 37 years. Emily had hired a demolition company to tear down several of the more deteriorated outbuildings before putting the property on the market, and the hay barn was on their list. When the crew arrived with their equipment, the foreman, a methodical man named Jake Morrison, decided to do a final walkthrough of each building before beginning the demolition work. He wanted to make sure there were no hazardous materials or valuable items that needed to be removed before the structures were torn down. Getting into the barn required crowbars and considerable effort, as the wooden boards had swollen and warped over decades of weather. When Morrison and his crew finally pried open the main door, they were met with the musty smell of old hay and something else. Something that made Morrison pause and reach for his flashlight. The interior of the barn was dim, illuminated only by a few gaps in the damaged roof where sunlight filtered through, creating dusty beams that revealed a space frozen in time. What they found changed everything. Parked in the center of the barn, covered by a thick layer of dust but otherwise intact, was a red Ford pickup truck with the license plate that Emily recognized immediately from the missing person reports filed 37 years earlier. On the passenger seat, as if it had been carefully placed there just moments before, sat a blue baseball cap with Mitchell Farms embroidered in yellow thread. The hat that Tom had worn every day of his adult life. The hat that Sarah had given him for his 45th birthday, just 2 months before the storm. Morrison immediately called Emily, who called Sheriff Clayton's office. Within hours, the barn was surrounded by police vehicles, and Detective Maria Santos, who had inherited the cold case files when she joined the department 5 years earlier, was documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that after 37 years, every detail might be crucial. The truck was exactly as Tom had left it that day in 1987, down to the work gloves on the dashboard and the thermos of coffee, now long evaporated in the cup holder. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the truck gotten into the barn? The doors had been sealed from the outside after the tornado, and there was no evidence that they had been opened since 1987. More puzzling still, there was no sign of Tom himself. The truck showed no damage from the storm, no indication that it had been caught in the tornado's path. It looked as if Tom had simply driven into the barn, removed his hat, and vanished. Emily stood in the doorway of the barn, staring at her father's truck and trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The vehicle that searchers had looked for across 3 counties was here, less than a mile from where she had grown up, hidden in plain sight in a building that everyone assumed was empty. She reached out to touch the truck's tailgate, and her fingers came away covered in dust that felt like the remnants of decades of unanswered prayers. Detective Santos began the painstaking process of processing what had suddenly become an active crime scene. The truck would need to be examined by forensic specialists, the barn would need to be searched inch by inch, and every aspect of Tom Mitchell's disappearance would need to be re-examined in light of this new evidence. But even as she made her notes and took her photographs, Santos couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was going to raise more questions than it answered. The news of the truck's discovery spread through Millbrook County within hours, carried by the kind of informal communication network that exists in every small rural community. At the care facility, Emily sat beside her mother's bed and tried to explain what had been found, but Sarah's stroke had affected her ability to process complex information, and she could only nod and squeeze Emily's hand with her good arm. Emily wasn't even sure her mother fully understood what she was being told, but there were tears in Sarah's eyes, and Emily chose to believe that some part of her mother's heart was finally finding a kind of peace. The forensic examination of the truck revealed few additional clues. The vehicle was mechanically sound, with no signs of violence or struggle. Tom's fingerprints were everywhere, of course, but there were no other prints that couldn't be accounted for. The hat showed no unusual wear or damage, and chemical analysis revealed nothing more than decades of accumulated dust and the faint traces of the aftershave that Emily remembered her father wearing. What bothered Detective Santos most was the question of how the truck had gotten into the barn. The building had definitely been sealed after the tornado. She had found documentation of the insurance claim and the boarding up work in the county records. Yet here was the truck, parked neatly in the center of the structure as if it had been placed there deliberately. The logical explanation was that Tom had driven into the barn seeking shelter from the storm. But if that were the case, where was he? The search of the barn itself yielded one additional piece of evidence, a small notebook that had fallen behind a stack of old hay bales. The notebook was water-damaged and mostly illegible, but forensic specialists were able to make out a few entries in Tom's handwriting. Most were routine farm notes, reminders about seed orders and equipment maintenance. But the final legible entry was dated June 15th, 1987, the day of the tornado. It read simply, "Storm coming fast. Taking shelter in North Barn. Tell Sarah and Emily I love them." This discovery seemed to confirm that Tom had indeed taken shelter in the barn during the tornado, but it deepened the mystery of what had happened next. If he had survived the storm well enough to write that note, why hadn't he returned home? And why had the barn been sealed with his truck still inside? Detective Santos interviewed everyone who had been involved in the original search and the post-tornado cleanup, but most of them were either dead or suffering from memory problems related to advanced age. The one person who might have had answers was Frank Weber, who had been Tom's closest neighbor and had helped with the cleanup work after the tornado. Weber was now 86 and living in the same care facility as Sarah, suffering from dementia that left his memory spotty and unreliable. But when Detective Santos showed him photographs of the barn and the truck, something seemed to stir in the old man's eyes. "Tommy was always careful," Weber said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Always put his tools away proper, never left nothing where it didn't belong." He studied the photograph of the truck for a long moment, then looked up at Santos with eyes that seemed suddenly clear and focused. "That truck shouldn't be in there. Tommy would never have parked it in the hay barn. Never." When pressed for more details, Weber became agitated and confused, repeating over and over that Tom would never have put the truck in the wrong place. The interview yielded no concrete information, but it reinforced Santos's growing suspicion that there was more to this story than a simple case of a man taking shelter during a storm and somehow becoming trapped or injured. The investigation expanded to include a thorough search of the surrounding area with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. If Tom had died somewhere near the barn and his body had been moved or buried, modern forensic techniques might be able to locate it. But after 3 weeks of intensive searching, they found nothing except the usual detritus of rural life: old farm equipment, discarded building materials, and the occasional animal skeleton. Emily found herself caught between hope and despair as the investigation progressed. Part of her was grateful to finally have some answers about what had happened to her father, but the discovery of the truck had opened up new possibilities that were almost harder to bear than not knowing. If her father had survived the tornado, even briefly, then perhaps he had suffered in ways that she had never imagined. The thought that he might have been trapped in the barn, injured and unable to call for help, was almost unbearable. The media attention that followed the discovery was both a blessing and a curse. National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the mystery of the truck that had hidden in plain sight for 37 years. The attention brought tips and theories from around the country, but it also brought unwanted intrusion into Emily's grief and her family's private pain. She found herself fielding calls from reporters, documentary filmmakers, and amateur detectives who were certain they could solve the case that had stumped professionals for decades. One call, however, proved to be different from the rest. It came from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a retired meteorologist who had studied the tornado outbreak of June 15, 1987, as part of her doctoral dissertation. Harper had maintained detailed records of the storm's path and intensity, and she believed she might have information that could help explain how Tom's truck had ended up in the sealed barn. "The tornado that hit your father's farm was part of a larger outbreak that produced several unusual phenomena," Harper explained when she met with Emily and Detective Santos. There were reports of objects being moved in ways that defied typical tornado behavior, not just lifted and thrown, but carefully relocated, as if they had been picked up and set down deliberately. Harper showed them weather radar images from that day, pointing out the distinctive hook echo that indicated the tornado's rotation. But what caught Santos's attention was Harper's description of witness reports from other areas hit by the same storm system. There had been multiple instances of vehicles being found in impossible locations: a school bus discovered on the roof of a grain elevator, a motorcycle found inside a church sanctuary with no apparent damage to the building's walls or windows. "Tornadoes can do strange things," Harper continued. "The pressure differentials and rotational forces can create effects that seem almost supernatural, but they're actually quite explainable once you understand the physics involved. It's possible that your father's truck was lifted by the tornado and then set down inside the barn through the damaged roof." This theory was intriguing, but it still didn't explain where Tom himself had gone. If the tornado had been powerful enough to lift the truck and deposit it in the barn, Surely it would have affected Tom as well. Santos found herself back at the same central question that had puzzled investigators for 37 years. What had happened to Tom Mitchell? The answer, when it finally came, arrived not through forensic science or meteorological analysis, but through the fading memory of an old man whose mind was slowly being claimed by dementia. Frank Weber had been agitated ever since Santos's visit, and the care facility staff reported that he had been talking constantly about Tommy and the storm and what we did. Emily, who visited her mother at the facility every day, began spending time with Weber as well, hoping that gentle conversation might help him remember something useful. It was during one of these visits that Weber, in a moment of clarity that sometimes comes to dementia patients, looked directly at Emily and said, "We couldn't tell nobody. Tommy made us promise." Over the course of several visits, Emily was able to piece together fragments of Weber's memories, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. The story that emerged was both simple and heartbreaking, and it explained everything, while somehow making the loss even more profound. Tom had indeed taken shelter in the barn during the tornado, Weber remembered, but he hadn't been alone. Weber and two other neighbors, both now deceased, had also sought refuge in the same building as the storm approached. They had watched through gaps in the barn walls as the tornado passed directly over them, lifting the roof partially away before setting it back down. When they emerged after the storm, they found Tom trapped under a heavy beam that had shifted during the tornado's passage. "We tried to move it," Weber whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Tried for hours. But Tommy was hurt bad, and we couldn't get him free without help. He was conscious at first, talking to us, telling us what to tell Sarah and Emily. But then..." Weber's memory became fragmented again, but Emily was able to understand the essential facts. Her father had died from his injuries while trapped in the barn, and Weber and the other men had made a decision that haunted Weber for the rest of his life. Rather than report the death and put Sarah through the trauma of seeing her husband's broken body, they had decided to make it appear that Tom had simply vanished in the storm. They had moved Tom's body to a location where it would never be found. Weber thought it might have been the old quarry that had since been filled in and turned into a housing development, and then sealed the barn with the truck still inside. The plan was to eventually discover the truck in a way that would give Sarah some closure without the horrible details of how Tom had actually died. But then, Weber's own life had taken unexpected turns. His wife had become ill, requiring years of care that consumed his attention and resources. The other two men involved in the cover-up had died, one in a farming accident just 2 years after the tornado, the other from cancer in the early 1990s. Weber had carried the secret alone for decades, planning to reveal the truth someday, but never finding the right moment, and eventually the burden of the knowledge had become lost in the fog of his deteriorating memory. Emily sat in Weber's room long after visiting hours had ended, holding the old man's hand and trying to process what she had learned. Her father had died on the day of the tornado, just as everyone had always assumed. But he had died trying to protect his friends, and his friends had tried to protect his family from additional pain. The deception had been born from love and good intentions, even if it had ultimately caused more suffering than it prevented. Detective Santos closed the case with mixed feelings. The mystery of Tom Mitchell's disappearance had been solved, but the solution raised ethical questions about Weber and his friend's decision to conceal the death. Under normal circumstances, concealing a death and moving a body would constitute serious crimes, but the men involved were either dead or too mentally impaired to stand trial. More importantly, Santos could understand the motivation behind their actions, even if she couldn't condone them. Sarah Mitchell died peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks after Emily learned the truth about her father's fate. Emily chose to believe that her mother had somehow sensed that the questions that had tormented her for 37 years had finally been answered, and that this knowledge had given her permission to let go. At Sarah's funeral, the church was packed with people who had known and loved the Mitchell family, and Emily found comfort in the community support that had sustained her mother through decades of uncertainty. The farm was sold to a young couple from Iowa who planned to restore it to full production. Emily kept her father's hat and a few other personal items, but she was relieved to see the land return to its intended purpose. The new owners planned to tear down the old hay barn and build a new equipment shed in its place, erasing the final physical reminder of the mystery that had defined Emily's family for most of her adult life. On a warm evening in late September, Emily stood in the kitchen of her childhood home for the last time, looking out the window where her mother had spent so many hours watching for Tom's return. The corn in the fields was ready for harvest, and the golden stalks rustled in the gentle breeze, creating the sound that had been the soundtrack of Emily's childhood. She thought about her father, about the choices he had made and the choices that others had made on his behalf, and she found herself feeling something she hadn't expected: gratitude. Tom Mitchell had died as he had lived, trying to protect others and putting his community's welfare ahead of his own comfort. The men who had concealed his death had acted out of love for their friend and his family, even though their decision had ultimately caused decades of pain and uncertainty. And Sarah Mitchell had spent 37 years loving a man who had never really left her, because the love they had shared was stronger than death, stronger than time, and stronger than the questions that had haunted her dreams. As Emily locked the farmhouse door for the final time and walked to her car, she carried with her not just the answers she had sought for so long, but also the understanding that some mysteries are meant to teach us about the endurance of love, the complexity of human motivation, and the way that truth, when it finally emerges, can bring both sorrow and peace in equal measure. The storm that had taken her father had long since passed, but the love that had sustained her family through 37 years of uncertainty would endure forever, as constant and reliable as the changing seasons that marked the passage of time on the Nebraska plains.